In this video, we'll cover Chapter 30, The War to End All Wars, Part 2. So we'll be talking about the peace following World War I. Wilson's role in shaping the peace was very significant, and he towered at the summit of popularity and power. No other man had ever occupied so dizzy a pinnacle as a moral leader of the world, and at this moment his sureness of touch deserted him, though, and he began to make a series of tragic fumbles. He called for the Democratic congressional victory in the election of November 1918, which backfired, and voters returned a narrow Republican majority to Congress. So Wilson went to Paris as a diminished leader without the majority of his party having the congressional majority. Wilson's trip infuriated the Republicans. To that time, no president had traveled to Europe, and it looked to the critics like he was grandstanding. He snubbed the Senate in assembling a peace delegation and neglected to include a single Republican senator in the delegation. The logical choice would have been a new chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was from Massachusetts, but Wilson loathed Lodge, and the feeling was reciprocated. So Wilson received tumultuous welcomes when he got to Europe, from the masses of France and England and Italy. At the Paris Conference in January 18, 1919, the Big Four met: Woodrow Wilson, Premier Orlando from Italy, Prime Minister George from Britain, and Premier Clemenceau from France. Wilson wanted to prevent the vengeful parceling of the colonies and protectorates of vanquished powers, and he was less attentive to the fate of the colonies belonging to the victorious French and English. This is a picture of Woodrow Wilson in Dover, England in 1919. He was hailed by many Europeans as the savior of the Western world, but he would become a fallen idol only a few months later. Victors received the conquered territory from Syria to France. Syria went to France, and Iraq went to England as trustees of the League of Nations. Basically, this was pre-war colonialism, and in the future, anti-colonial nationalists would wield Wilsonian ideals of self-determination against these imperial occupiers. Wilson envisioned the League as a world parliament, an assembly seat for all nations, and the council would be controlled by great powers. This would signal victory when diplomats made the League of Nations an integral part of the final peace treaty. Clemenceau pressed Wilson with the French demands for a rich coal area of the Saar Valley. France finally settled for a compromise. The Saar Valley would remain under the League for 15 years, and then popular vote would determine its fate. Wilson's next battle with Italy would be over Fiume as a valuable seaport to Italy and Yugoslavia. Wilson wanted Fiume to go to Yugoslavia and appealed over the heads of the Italian leaders. The maneuver fell flat. Wilson's next battle was with Japan. During the war, Japan had seized China's Shandong Peninsula and the German islands in the Pacific. Japan received the Pacific Islands under the League mandate. Wilson strongly opposed the Japanese control of the Shandong as a violation of self-determination for its 30 million Chinese. Wilson reluctantly accepted the compromise. Japan kept Germany's economic holdings in Shandong. They pledged to return the peninsula to China at a later date, and the Chinese were outraged by this imperialistic solution. The Treaty of Versailles was handed to Germans in June 1919. They had been excluded from the negotiations in Paris. They had hoped for a peace based on Wilson's 14 points. Vengeance, not reconciliation, was the treaty's dominant tone. The majority of the 14 points were not present in the resulting peace treaty, and there were loud and bitter cries of betrayal bursting from the Germans, and these were charges that Adolf Hitler would later use. Wilson was guilty of no conscious betrayal. The Allies were torn by conflicting aims, and Wilson had to compromise to get any agreement, and especially to salvage his beloved League of Nations. The treaty had much to commend it. The liberation of millions of minority peoples, for example the Poles, took place as a result. Returning to America, Wilson sailed straight into a political typhoon. The isolationists protested the treaty, especially Wilson's commitment to usher the United States into the new League of Nations. Senator Williams Beauregard from Idaho and Hiram Johnson from California and others were irreconcilables. They rejected any entangling alliances. Critics showered the Treaty of Versailles with abuse. For the Hun haters, people who were very angry with Germany, the pact was not harsh enough. The liberals thought it was too harsh, which was a gross betrayal. The hyphenated Americans, immigrants that came from other countries, were aroused because the peace settlement was not sufficiently favorable to their native lands. Irish Americans feared the League would empower England to crush any move for Irish independence. This is Contentious Nuptials. This is a political cartoon showing Woodrow Wilson's visionary effort to end more of a century of American aloofness from world affairs that meets with vigorous opposition from traditional isolationists in the U.S. The senators eventually refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, which shattered Wilson's dream of making the United States a more engaged international actor. The strong majority of people favored the treaty, and in July of 1919, Lodge had no real hope of defeating it. He only wanted to amend it, to Americanize it, Republicanize it, or senatorialize it. To divide public opinion, Lodge read the entire 264-page treaty aloud in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and held a protracted hearings on it to air grievances. Faced with such delaying tactics, Wilson decided to take his case to the nation. In a spectacular speech-making tour undertaken despite protests of physicians and friends who were concerned about his health and welfare, Wilson's frail body began to sag under the strains of the death of his first wife in 1914, the partisan strife he was experiencing, the global war he had dealt with, and the stressful peace conference. His speech tour began in September 1919 with a lame start in the isolationist strongholds of the Midwest. The Rocky Mountain region and the Pacific Coast welcomed him. The high point of his tour and the breaking point of the return trip was in Pueblo, Colorado, September 25, 1919. With tears coursing down his face, Wilson pleaded for the League of Nations as the only hope of preventing future wars, and that night he collapsed from physical and nervous exhaustion. He was whisked back to Washington, where several days later he suffered a stroke. He laid in a darkened room in the White House for several weeks. For more than 7 months, he did not meet with the cabinet. Senator Lodge was now at the helm, and he came up with 14 formal reservations to the 14 points. He reserved the rights of the United States under the Monroe Doctrine and the Constitution to protect U.S. sovereignty. Wilson was still strong enough to obstruct, and he sent word to all true Democrats to vote against the treaty with the Lodge reservations attached. And Wilson hoped that when these were cleared away, the path would be opened for ratification. Loyal Democrats in the Senate on November 19, 1919 did exactly what Wilson had asked, and they combined with the irreconcilables and they rejected the treaty, 55 votes to 39. The nation was deeply shocked by this verdict. In March of 1920, the treaty was brought up again with the Lodge reservations tacked on. Wilson again sent word to the loyal Democrats to vote down the treaty with the obnoxious reservations. He thus signed the death warrant of the treaty as far as Americans were concerned, and on March 19, 1920, the treaty netted the simple majority but failed to get the necessary two-thirds majority by the count of 49 yeas to 35 nays. Who defeated the treaty really? Lodge did, by basically through his Wilson personal feud. Both Lodge and Wilson have to bear responsibility too. But the traditionalism, isolationism, disillusionment, and partisanship all contributed as well. But Wilson must bear a substantial share of the responsibility because he asked the Democrats to veto the bill those 2 times. So he asked for all or nothing and got nothing. The Solemn Referendum was Wilson's solution to the deadlock treaty, was to decide the issue in the presidential campaign of 1920. The Republicans gathered in Chicago in June, and the Senate bosses decided on Senator Warren G. Harding from Ohio as the candidate. For vice president, they nominated Silent Cal Coolidge of Massachusetts. The Democrats met in San Francisco and nominated Governor James Cox of Ohio, who was a strong supporter of the League of Nations, and his running mate would be Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Democrats attempted to make the election a referendum on the League of Nations. The effort was muddled by contradictory statements by Warren G. Harding. So the election returns in 1920 were very different because of the newly enfranchised women who swelled the vote totals. Harding had the plurality of over 7 million votes, over 16 million to over 9 million for Cox. This was the largest victory margin to date in a presidential election. The electoral count was 404 to 127. Debs, federal prisoner number 9653 at the Atlanta Penitentiary, rolled up the largest socialist vote ever in this election with over 919,000 votes. The public desire for change resulted in the repudiation of the high and mighty Wilsonism. People were eager to go back to normalcy, and they were willing to accept a second-rate president, and they really got a third-rate one. Harding's victory was a death sentence for the League of Nations. The politicians increasingly shunned the League as a leper, and when Wilson died in 1924, his great vision of the League of Nations for peace had perished long before. America's spurning of the League was very short-sighted. The Republic had helped to win the war, but foolishly kicked the fruits of victory under the table. The League was undercut by the refusal of the mightiest power on the globe to join it. It became an ultimate failure, and this ultimate failure lay at America's doorstep. The League was designed, along with 4 other peace treaties, to rest upon the United States. The Senate spurned the security treaty with France. France then undertook to build a powerful military as a result, and Germany also began to rearm illegally. The United States had hurt its own cause when it buried its head in the sand, and they should have assumed the war-borne responsibility and embraced the role of global leader, and they should have used its strength to shape the world events. Many of these events will lay the groundwork from World War I for the causes of World War II.